Before we move any further, it will be a good idea to check out some of the other life cycle events of React. You have already learned about the render function, which is the only function that is required. So if you are creating a React component, you must have a render function, or else, well, it's not really going to work. And first of all, let's go ahead and check it out that when the render function is getting fired. So I'm just going to go ahead and say render. That's the best way for you to learn about the life cycle of the events. If I simply say render, I can see that the render is getting fired. But why is it firing 2 times? That's the first question, right? Why is this firing 2 different times? The render is fired 2 times because in index.js, we are wrapping our app component with something called React strict mode. The React strict mode was introduced later on, and basically it helps to identify components with unsafe life cycles, legacy, string, deprecated events and deprecated functions, detecting side effects, and if you're using deprecated context or some other APIs. So I do not recommend that you remove it, keep it there, because it's not actually rendering per se. I mean, when it fires render, it's simply checking that everything is kind of like up to date and good to go. All right. So render is the only function that is required, but there are some other functions. There is something called a component will mount. This particular function is fired right before the component is mounted on the virtual DOM, basically on the React DOM that is controlled by React. So we can go ahead and put a console.log over here also and put the name of the function so that we know that it is being called. Next we have component did mount, and once again we're just going to go ahead and put some sort of a log over here indicating that the function has been called. And let's go ahead and save it. And now if you go on the top, you can see the first one getting fired is component will mount, then we fire the render, and then we fire component did mount. So will comes before did. Now in the new versions of React, component will mount is deprecated. So in other words, you shouldn't really use that. So we can remove this function. So the main two functions that you'll be dealing with if you are using the class-based React components will be the render, the component did mount, and sometimes if you have to declare some sort of a state, then you will always be using a constructor. And don't forget to call super in the constructor, or else it's going to complain. Now, in React, there are many other lifecycle events. If I simply start typing component, you can see component did cache, component did update, component will receive props, will unmount, will update, so many more. But I would say that you can achieve 80 to 90% of what you want to do by just learning these render and component did mount, and obviously the constructor when you have to initialize the state. Now, if you do want to learn more about the events, I will go ahead and add a link to the events and state and lifecycle in the YouTube description, where you can go to the link official documentation and read more about it. All right, so now let's go to the next lecture in which you're going to learn how to perform a fetch request, download the data from some JSON API, and then display it on the screen.